Welcome to the At Sea podcast. I am your host, Justin McRoberts. Now, before I dive in here, I want to extend a special thanks to the patrons who've backed this work recently. They had early access to this episode, as they do every episode of the podcast. They're really actually helping me not only to continue to do the work of the podcast, but to improve it. If you'd like to join our team, you can jump to patreon.com. That's Patreon, patreon.com, and search my name, Justin McRoberts. And now on to episode 17.
So these are just ordinary people who were seeking to live out what it means to be a citizen in the United States. Dr. King used to often say that all we're saying to America is be true to what you said on paper. And so they were holding them accountable. So whether that was the 9 students in Little Rock who wanted to live out the promise of Brown, or whether that was the Freedom Riders who were living out the promise of integrated interstate transportation. That's all they were doing.
Some of my guests are people who make national news. They win Grammys and National Book Awards. But this will never be a podcast about what's most popular or what's trending, per se. My interest is connecting you with great culture makers because I believe what they do deepens and enriches our lives. My guest on this episode is professor and cultural curator, Dr. Todd Allen. Since 2002, Dr. Todd has not only taught in the classroom about the history of the civil rights movement, but has led a bus tour to many of the sites vital to the movement itself. In doing so, he connects dots that might otherwise live in disparate parts of his guests' hearts and minds. I caught up with him in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania recently, and thought the conversation I had with him might help you and I connect a few of those same dots. Check it out. Here's where I would want to go is what really fascinated me about your work, because you're a teacher predominantly.
Yep.
And then over the last, kind of as an extension of being a teacher, over the last few years, you've developed this tour you do.
Right.
So can you kind of give me a little bit of that history in terms of like becoming a teacher? You're from Pennsylvania. Sure. You left. I guess there are kind of two stories here I want to hang out in. One is that's because they're both things happen at the same time. You have this sense of place, like you kind of feel like you belong where you are. Like Pennsylvania is home. You left for a stretch and then came back, and you're teaching, and then you're sort of taking people from here on this tour, which in a sense is still kind of like giving people really still a sense of place, but in history. Right. So, like, talk a little bit about kind of your journey. Okay. Academically, you thought about teaching. You were in high school. A little bit of what we went yesterday. Like, how do you get here from there a while ago?
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I said, I grew up learning this history both at home as well as in high school, particularly my early years of high school. Yeah. And when you grow up in a certain place, that's the world to you. And so I thought every kid in America had mandatory 2 years. I mean, it wasn't mandatory for us, but 2 years of African American history. And it was only when I got to college at an HBCU that I realized what a unique experience that I had coming up. I did not actually intend to get into teaching. As a kid, I had an uncle, great uncle, who, before I even knew what a lawyer was, would always tell me, "You're going to be a lawyer. You're going to be a lawyer."
Really?
And I would agree because I was like, "Hey, this is my uncle. I love him, respect him. I don't know what a lawyer is." As I got older, in fact, he passed away my freshman year of college. This would have been in 1987. As I got older, I realized he came of age in a generation where he saw the walls of Jim Crow begin to tumble through things like Brown versus the Board of Ed. And so figures like Thurgood Marshall. Yeah. And so for him, next to being a preacher, the most noble thing you could be is a lawyer. And
like that's where, like, if you're going to take a stance in the battle,
that's it.
Like, here's where the power, here's where the seat of power is in the courts.
And so when he would look at me, he said, "You're going to be a lawyer. You're going to be a lawyer." The teaching thing is interesting because, as I mentioned, I was really molded and shaped by a teacher who has remained an influence in my life. And I'll never forget the first time she went on the trip, and she was talking with a reporter about her experience on this journey. And she said, never could I have imagined in all those years that I was teaching this history that one of my students would then take me to the place to meet these people. And then several years after that, my student who helped actually grow the tour came on the trip, and I knew in that moment what my teacher had felt, because I felt the same thing. Here's one of my students who helped take this a step further.
Another man done gone from the county, from another man done gone. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his name.
Now, when you said earlier, I want to get into something, you said it wasn't until college that you realized that not everyone had 2 years of African American history. How did you figure that out? Like, you went to college, and like, I
went to college in Atlanta. And I would just, in casual conversations with people, I would, mention things like, for example, one night, Stokely Carmichael was going to be speaking on campus. And I thought, this is just phenomenal. And I'm talking to some of my fellow classmates and say, hey, you're going to hear Stokely Carmichael. I was like, who's that?
Who is that?
So, I would get a lot of these kind of who's that reactions, both, at the HBCU and then when I transferred, back home to Pennsylvania. Now, as far as the teaching aspect, I did think about going into history as a major. I was a communication major in undergrad. I did think about history, but at that time, I thought all you could do with a history degree is teach, and I do not want to be a teacher. That's what I said to myself.
Yeah, you don't want to just regurgitate dates and facts.
Well, again, it didn't even matter what the subject was. I was like, I just don't want to be a teacher.
That's good.
And so I laugh looking at where my career, has gone, because lo and behold, what do I do? But teach. When I graduated undergrad, I say, thank goodness I'm never reading a book or writing another paper again. And then you go on to grad school, and now you're reading students' papers and all of that. And so when a lot of people find out that I teach in the college level, they assume I teach history because of these civil rights tours. And then they're actually kind of shocked when they find out I do communication studies. And I said, that's the thing about the way life works, is that you can have multiple interests. You can have multiple callings. You're not limited to doing just one thing. And you can, find ways to pursue all of those passions equally.
Yeah, and then part of what you end up finding out, like we were talking about a second ago, is like, if it's you and you're paying attention and you have multiple interests per se, there still ends up being a thread that sort of holds all those things together. Oh,
I've been able to weave this history into what I do in the communication classroom on more than one occasion. So I definitely see that consistency.
Tell me how the tour started, and then tell me like what it actually looks like to be on it.
Well, how it actually began was I was invited. A friend from college, from undergrad, was putting together a trip for campus ministers from CCO, Coalition for Christian Outreach. And about a month or so before his trip, he had asked me to, recommend some books, actually a couple months before his trip, for them to read. And then a month before the trip, he says, well, you're going with me, right? And I said, no. I said, I'm not going. He said, what do you mean you're not going? And I said, well, I've been to Atlanta. I've been to Memphis. I've seen Eyes on the Prize. I know it. And I kind of laughed that I actually said that to him, because people say that to me now.
Right.
And he goes, no, you've got to go. And, as I was sharing with you before, he shared this book with me about a pastor by the name of Reverend Robert Gretz that I had never heard of before.
Yeah, and neither had I until yesterday when we were talking.
And I thought, if I haven't heard this guy's story, what are some other stories I don't know? And so fortunately, I went on that trip. That was 17 years ago. I went on that trip, came back, was telling people about the experience that I had. And one of the people I told was my history teacher from high school. And she had just retired at that point. And she said, you should plan a trip. And I tell people, I was like, I'm glad I didn't know how hard that was, because I probably wouldn't have done it.
the Gretz story.
Yeah.
That sort of like there was because even for you, like, well, hey, when we talked about this a little bit yesterday as well, it's like there's this kind of baseline knowledge that the average person has about the civil rights movement and about the civil rights era, and to some degree, you said like you were kind of making that same assumption and mistake.
Yes.
Like, I've got all the information I need, and then you get hit with this story that you didn't know about this white pastor. Can you retell that story a little bit?
Yeah. When we talk about that baseline knowledge, I said that Southern Poverty Law Center did a report, and it said people know 2 names, 4 words: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. Yeah. And now I knew a little bit more than that, but I was still caught up in the big names. Yeah. And so when my friend handed me this book called A White Preacher's Memoir, it's about this Lutheran pastor named Reverend Robert Gretz. I had never heard of Gretz before. And the first thing that intrigued me is here was a white guy who pastored an all-black congregation in Montgomery in the mid-1950s. I didn't think such a thing happened in the Jim Crow South, but it did. And so what makes Gretz really, really fascinating is when Mrs. Parks is arrested and the call goes out to boycott the buses for the one day, that Monday. One of the places that it was to be announced was in churches, and pastoring an all-black congregation. Gretz knew that he would need to make some announcement to his congregation, but he wanted to confirm the information, and so he called his next-door neighbor to get some more details on, was this true? Is there going to be a one-day protest? And then towards the end of the conversation, he says, well, do you know who it was? And Gretz says there was this pause, and the person says yes. And he says, well, who was it? And the person says, it was me. Gretz's good friend and next door neighbor was Rosa Parks. So Gretz knew at this point, no one knew that there was going to be this, over a year-long boycott.
No.
But he knew at this point that he was going to make an announcement, definitely. And that whatever was going to happen, he was going to be getting involved.
And what a fascinating twist twist. It's not even a twist. What a fascinating detail.
Yeah.
In civil rights history.
What a cool moment. Still, yeah.
And
so then I go back to those books that I had been reading, growing up reading about the civil rights movement, and there were names like Robert Gretz and Mrs. Johnny Carr and other figures that I now know and know well, but because they weren't quote unquote the big names, in my younger years I skipped over a lot of those. And so that's what's been fascinating then. For these 16 years now, we've taken hundreds of people from all over the country on an 8-9 day bus trip to a lot of the key southern sites of the movement.
Once you're on the tour, what's a person experiencing once they're there?
Oh my! We've talked about the issue of place a little bit, and I tell people that this concept, the power of place, being in the places where this history happened, but then also having the blessing to be there with the people who made this history. Yeah. So here's a typical example. You will be on a bus driving from Montgomery 50 miles into Selma, and you're watching a film of the voting rights struggle in Selma, particularly Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And just as that clip is finishing, now that bus is riding across the very bridge where 51, 52 years ago this beating occurred when people were marching for the right to vote. You get off that bus, and then you're standing there with people who you just saw in that film. People like Joanne Bland, who was 11 years old at the time and participated in those demonstrations, or people like Reverend Frederick Reese, who was the head of the Dallas County Voters League and the Selma City Teachers Association, that invited King to come to Selma. And there you are with these people. It's just a way of bringing history to life that the best film, the best book can't quite capture.
And I love there really is this it's like this cohesion between place and people.
Yes.
And you're sort of getting to that you can be in that same you can drive through Selma.
Right.
And just to drive through it.
Right.
And that doesn't mean you were in Selma in the same way that someone who was on your tour is.
Well, we've been starting to see this now for like the last 5-6 years because everyone's getting older. And we're losing a lot of these authentic voices. The veterans are passing on. And we see it in places like Montgomery. You know, Montgomery is not the same tour that it was a decade ago. You know, when we had figures like a Johnny Carr or a Judge Thomas Gray and that kind of thing. You know, so we're losing these figures, and that does change the dynamic. I mean, like you said, you can visit some of these museums and spaces, you know, anytime. But to be there with the people, and to hear the stories.
They sort of give roots to the place. The place becomes like an actual location, and there's like a power to it because of the actual individuals and their histories that live there.
You know, you got me thinking, because it's funny you just used that word roots, and that's what we call our tour, Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights. And we could go there are tons of places we could go. We only have so much time to get so many places. But we tell people that, you know, we pick where we've gone for a reason. And so that it's that when you do then return to wherever you're from in this country, number one, learn about the history of what was going on in that area at that time. But two, what's going on presently, and where are you in that cause of social justice in your community? Because if you go on the trip and you just get some autographs and some nice photos and some T-shirts, you've missed the meaning of it. It's about, I mean, like, you can't go to Selma and then go home and not be registered to vote, and not think about running for office yourself. I mean, I've seen people do that, but you've missed the meaning if you don't then understand the importance of the ballot. And that's just one example.
Oh, my God, promise me a home. Oh, Jesus, Lord have mercy. My God, promise me a home. I got a home where the gambler can go. I got a home where the gambler can go. Oh, Jesus, Lord have mercy. I got a home where the gambler can go.
Another bit that we talked about yesterday has to do with the continuity of there's the civil rights era, and this is a mistake I know I make in my own mind. There's the civil rights era, which is to say it ended. And the historical figures of the civil rights movement, as if it was a thing that happened in time and place, which to some degree that's true. There's you know. And then there's and you even hear me say it. And then there is today. But
whereas what we sometimes call the post-civil rights,
as if there is a post-civil rights, and as if B, and maybe this is actually point A, is wasn't the point of, or wasn't part of the intention of the civil rights movement, to that there would be a continuity. So what is it about our communication of and our conversation around in schools and interpersonally about the civil rights era that like allows for this lack of continuity, where I can look back and have a conversation with pretty much any room of people at any point anywhere in the country and feel really great about the civil rights era and the civil rights heroes and what a wonderful time, and yes, these but I can't draw that same kind of line. I can't draw a line between that and anything that looks like the civil rights movement now, and specifically that, like, I don't recognize the critiques of things like the Black Lives Matter movement as almost identical to the critiques of the civil rights movement. Like, where is it that we've maybe dropped the ball or failed in our conversations around civil rights in the era that there is this massive gap between our understanding and appreciation for then versus our ability to enter into the now?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. One, you know, the narrative that we often tell of the civil rights movement is that, you know, that was then, this is now, we have overcome. And so to continue to reflect on our shortcomings as a country disrupts the comfortable narrative we like to tell. There were heroes and there were bad guys, and we think the bad guys were only those who wore white robes and burned crosses. Those were the only bad guys,
right?
The way we like to tell it. But we defeated the bad guys because good wins, and that's the end of the story. And so we tell that sort of sanitized version. And the late Reverend Billy Kyles used to say, particularly looking at it, though it's not just a black-white issue, but he said, speaking specifically in black-white, he said, for blacks, talking about the past is often too painful, and for whites, it's often too shameful. But if we're going to move forward as a country on issues of race, we've got to confront our pain and our shame of our shared history, because this is not African American history. I mean, I think that's the other thing is we talk about this history from Martin Luther King Day through the end of February, and then we go back to business as usual, and we've got to move away from that as well. We've got to learn to expand the national narrative to include all people's stories. And so I think one of the reasons we continue to trip up over race is we don't know our shared and collective
There's a kind of a
story.
Compartmentalization,
right?
That there's a class about black
right.
history in America,
and that it's for black people. That's the thing. When participants that come on my trip, it never fails that I will. First of all, I actually attract more whites than I do, of other groups. But it never fails. I'll always get, some student, maybe an undergrad or graduate student, who about 2 or 3 days into the trip will kind of slide up beside me on the bus and say, I'm so glad I came on this. I was told by, fill in the blank, my father, my grandmother, don't go on that because they're just going to tell you how bad white people are. And that's got nothing to do with you and blah, and that kind of thing. And they say, but then I came on this trip and I learned about Reverend Gretz, or I learned about Miss Viola Liuzzo, or I learned about college students who were part of Freedom Summer or the Freedom Rides that look like me.
Yep.
And so now I know this is my story, too. So
somebody is like identifying the civil rights movement and the civil rights era as not a black movement only.
Right.
That whites could participate in, but that it was a moment that was certainly led by African American individuals, but was also, when you talk about the gentleman who invited King, you mentioned his name a little while ago,
Reverend Reese, to Selma,
without that detail, he was invited in, to come, and without those folks, that that moment doesn't happen.
Well, like I was saying yesterday, the civil rights movement, there are many themes that you can pull from it, but one is those ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Like, a lot of people are surprised. Many of these veterans still live in those towns where the events happened because those were their hometowns. Yeah. A lot of them are in the phone book. Because again, this is where they have lived life. I tell people it's as though the movement happened in your hometown. You'd probably still be there or have some family that reside there. So these are just ordinary people who were seeking to live out what it means to be a citizen in the United States. Dr. King used to often say that all we're saying to America is be true to what you said on paper. And so they were holding them accountable. So whether that was the 9 students in Little Rock who wanted to live out the promise of Brown, or whether that was the Freedom Riders who were living out the promise of integrated interstate transportation. That's all they were doing. Now, they were labeled as being un-American, disruptive, unpatriotic, all those things that we put on social movements like Black Lives Matter today. But the issue is still the same. The movement veterans, to a person, will say and believe freedom's a constant struggle. In fact, one of the tough things sometimes we have when we're meeting with these veterans on the trip, we try not to pigeonhole them, but if I'm in Selma, people do want to hear some stories about 1960s Selma. But for these activists, because they've lived lives of activism, what happened in 1965 Selma is just as important as what's happening in 2017 Selma. And so for people to even get that sense that, we're still at work here. There's still a lot of work to be done. It doesn't matter who's in the governor's mansion or who's in the White House. Injustice persists, and people of conscience and goodwill have to keep working.
That's good. Thanks for your time.
Oh, man. Thank you, my brother, man. This has been a blessing, man.
Absolutely. I really do only wish that somehow audio-wise, I could capture that bow tie, because that is magic. It's wonderful.
Well, like I said, my wife dresses me.
It's beautiful. That's good. Thank you, Brent. Appreciate it. And thank you for joining me for this episode of the podcast. You can dig into the additional resources, the things referenced in my conversation with Dr. Todd, including links actually to Dr. Todd's tour by visiting atseapodcast.com. That's ATSEA podcast.com. Until next time.